Okay, well, I think we'll make a start. So welcome everybody to today's webinar. So before we get started, I just wanted to raise two issues. The first was around the Medical Research Future Fund Priorities Consultation, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of. And as an association, we're certainly aiming to make a submission. But to inform that submission, we're keen to hear from members, and in particular, if you're making an individual submission, it would be good if you're able to share that with us, because that will give us it will inform our submission. The deadline is towards the end of August, so it'd be good to get some input in the next couple of weeks, and then we can start putting that together. And then the second issue I just wanted to raise was about the association's annual event, which coincides with our AGM. So this year we're holding it on the 26th of November, which is the day before the NHMRC Translation Symposium starts. So we've kind of linked it in with that event, hoping that people who are coming to Sydney for the Translation Symposium might come a day early and attend our event. And Rachel Morton is taking the lead in that event, and she's going to be she's putting a very interesting program together around the use of patient-reported outcome measures in the healthcare system. So please bear that in mind and keep an eye out for further details. So today we're very pleased to have Stephen Lewis here to talk about healthcare regulation, and I think it might raise some interesting proposals around making regulation fit for purpose in today's healthcare system. So Stephen's a health policy and research consultant. He's recently moved to Melbourne from Saskatoon, is that good pronunciation, in Canada. He's an adjunct professor of health policy at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. And he's previously sat on the boards of bodies such as the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Saskatchewan Health Quality Council, and the Health Council of Canada. And he writes on a range of issues, including improving quality, equity, and performance. But as I say, today he's going to talk about regulation. So before I hand over, just to say that if you kind of think of comments and questions as Stephen's talking, please feel free to just type those into the chat box, and then I'll feed those to Stephen, mainly at the end. But if there's anything that comes up that requires clarification as Stephen's going through, I might raise those as we go through. So I think Stephen's going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then
yes, I hope
something like that, and then we'll have some time for discussion afterwards. So thank you, Stephen.
Great, thank you very much, and look forward to meeting some of you at some point during my stay in Australia. You'll have to excuse me a little bit for two things: my accent, or as we Canadians would say, my absence of an accent, and I'm just at the tail end of a cold, so my voice may not be perfect, but at least it's not communicable in this format. So as you can see from the title, I'm going to pitch an idea that regulators and regulation needs a bit of reinvention to be current and relevant and impactful. I do quite a bit of work with regulators, and I think they would agree with me in large part that, and that also they're constantly rethinking how they can be more effective. And I'm going to try to, excuse me, unpack some of the reasons why regulation faces challenges, both conceptually and practically, and what it might do in order to be more impactful in the future. So regulation is a very big topic, and I'm only covering one aspect of it today, but if in the discussion you want to address some other related types of regulation, that's fine with me. So this presentation is about the regulation of healthcare professions and professionals. It's not about the other forms of regulation that apply to these other areas that you can see on the slide. And here's my starting points. Path dependency affects everything we do pretty much institutionally. That what went before is a pretty good predictor of what we have now and what we are likely to have in the future. But I think we can break free of it non-incrementally. So there is a latitude here, and I think there's a particularly opportune set of options that regulators are examining now, and the timing is pretty good for a number of reasons, which I will elaborate on later. And I also think it's important to note that health professional regulation, to me, is not an intrinsic good. It's justified by its impact, as are other forms of regulation. Regulation, in its best form, of course, protects the public interest, improves performance, and so on. But regulation is unavoidably a burden, a tax, if you like, and we should pay it and endure it to the extent to which it is useful. I don't expect health professional regulation to solve every problem in the healthcare system, but the question is, can it solve more than it actually does? Interestingly, I mean, it seems pretty obvious that regulation can't and shouldn't define itself, but since regulation in the health professions arose out of a tradition whereby professions were given the entitlement to self-regulate, it often has defined itself in the past. And whether we can integrate it more with other efforts to enhance the public interest, I think is an important question. And again, I start from the outside in. I don't think we can have an abstract discussion about the utility and future directions of HPR unless we understand what roles we want it to fulfill in a health system whose aims and ambitions we also assent to. So these are the questions that I've asked myself for this presentation. Again, of course, you may have others which you should feel free to raise. And to open, I will sincerely tip my hat to Australia, because you have done some things structurally that we have been unable to do in Canada, and I don't think any other country has done quite as much as you have. You do have a national health professional regulation body in a federalist country where the states and the Commonwealth government duke it out over various things, just like Canada. So the fact that you've got this done is quite remarkable and praiseworthy. It spans 15 occupations, and those occupations by individual memoranda or memorandum delegate certain powers to the national body. You do have a single registration system for these occupations that, among other things, removes barriers to mobility between states and territories for healthcare workers, which again seems pretty obvious, but we haven't achieved that in other jurisdictions. It was interesting in some ways that it's easier for a nurse to move from Warsaw to Liverpool than it is for a nurse to move from New Brunswick to British Columbia in Canada. I don't know if that's literally true, but it's interesting that it's even a plausible thing to say. You've done quite a bit to eliminate duplication and fragmentation of various forms of efforts. And certainly there are imperfections in it, but certainly I think Canadians would envy what you have achieved structurally with the APRA structure. So what do we want? I think we all want healthcare excellence, and healthcare excellence is multidimensional. It involves goals. You have to measure performance. If you really want to know how well you're doing, there has to be various forms of accountability. People have to commit to achieving excellence. You need quality people. You need good governance. You need adequate resources, and you need regulation. So what is the R squared, or the explanatory value, or the maximum impact of regulation in contributing to healthcare excellence? Well, I think that is the question. Among other things, the elements of this schematic, and of course there can be many options to this one, should be integrated. They should all be unified by a common vision and a common understanding of what healthcare excellence is. So regulation, I think this is the fundamental problem. This is the standard distribution curve. And here's what we used to think was the zone of concern. This is the quality assurance notion, historical notion of health professional regulation. So you can posit your own standard deviations from the middle where you think the problems lie, but it's the outliers that is the focus of the QA approach. And a lot of regulation historically, and even by mandate, deals with addressing problems in performance, outlier problems. So that's been the usual zone of concern. But if you're a health services researcher, and importantly, if your orientation is quality improvement rather than quality assurance, I think it's fair to say that the evidence-based zone of concern is a lot bigger. So you can put that vertical line anywhere you want to. I've stuck it in the middle, but I think we've even moved to the right to a certain extent. And why I say that is if you look at some famous and seminal studies, such as the variations in practice studies by the producers of the Dartmouth Atlases and so on, and the huge volume of unjustified variation in practice literature from multiple countries. If you look at the famous Elizabeth McGlynn study in the United States, which suggested that people get the primary health care services they need based on high quality evidence about 50% of the time, that there are many problems in healthcare that are in the middle of the curve. And if regulation is to be active in solving that problem and moving the entire curve over to the right, if you will, then the traditional QA approach is not going to be particularly effective. It will continue to be effective where it is, over on the left in dealing with the outliers, but not in dealing with a large proportion of the problems that define sub-excellent and suboptimal healthcare. So there is a paradox here. And the paradox for regulation of health professionals consists of these elements. We do have a much better trained workforce than ever. Regulation is more sophisticated than ever. The technology is better. The analytics are better. But we still have a healthcare system with all of these smart people who aren't even admitted to health science education programs unless they are pretty elite students. And we have all of these tools and techniques, and the knowledge base has expanded so much. How come healthcare is still so plagued with variation, unjustified variation, error, harm, and waste? Well, one reason is that while from a rational actor, purely logical perspective, good practice should be pretty easy in some areas, it seems to be harder than it looks. I mean, it's perplexing, and it has perplexed people for decades now, why hand washing rates remain distressingly low in so many facilities and so many programs, as if there's anything that's a whole lot simpler to achieve than hand washing. But when you unpack it, there are reasons why all of these things occur. We've known for a very long period of time that a triennial pap test for non-indicated people, that is general population testing, is perfectly adequate, but yet annual pap tests remain common. Many congestive heart failure patients don't get the required interventions. These are things that many lay people would know how to do, let alone highly trained medical practitioners. We still have many asymptomatic men getting screening PSA tests despite the huge body of evidence that suggests that the harms occasioned by false positives greatly outweigh the benefits of the added capture of true positives. And these failures occur every day in every healthcare system. And they're based on decisions made by professionals whom regulators have determined are worthy of certification, licensure, and ongoing designation or assumptions about competence. So regulators know this, health services researchers know this, many practitioners are aware of this. I think all are vexed by it. What can be done, and does regulation have a role? So, just as to give you an empirical example, this is my province, Saskatchewan, which is a province of 1.2 million people. It was until recently divided into health regions, and these are the radical prostatectomy rates per 10,000 population. Over 5 years of data, the vertical bars are the confidence intervals. Now, I've circled the rates for the two largest regions, which have about 300,000 people in. in each. And as you can see, there is triple the rate of radical prostatectomy in Regina compared to Saskatoon. Well, they can't both be right, yet everybody who's doing these prostatectomies or not doing them, depending on your perspective and whether there is underutilization or overutilization, they're all competent. Well, if they're all competent and their decision-making is all competent, what is regulation really assuring us of, and what are the standards that define competency in a healthcare system? I think it's a question that really does need to be addressed. So what does the quality improvement literature say about regulation, credentials, and licensure? And as you know, there's a massive QI literature about with human factors and all of the various approaches to improving quality. It doesn't address it at all. Now, maybe the literature just assumes that regulation, credentials, and licensure are fully in place, but it's quite striking, actually, how there is no call for improved regulation, credentials, and licensure as one of the avenues to greater quality improvement, which suggests that the quality improvement experts think that this is much more local work, it's much more process work, measurement work, human relationship based, and it really, one can't look to regulation and credentialing and licensure as having an enormous impact on continuous quality improvement. So I think that's also a sobering assessment, and I think regulators are well aware of this. So the question, which I'll pose later again in more depth, is so where should regulation be in the QI business? Should it be in that business at all? I think one of the explanations is that there is in the literature a growing awareness that intrinsic motivation is much more likely to produce sustained excellence than extrinsic motivation, that is, motivation by externally imposed standards, rules, scrutiny, and so on. And regulation is inherently extrinsic. And that is the relationship the regulated have with the regulator. So again, I think psychologically and in other operational ways, it's much more difficult for regulation to be a powerful motivator compared to the other forms of intrinsic motivation. And furthermore, what performance assessment has tended to do is to focus on what professionals know and do. So know is usually the proxy is how do you do on certification, licensure, and in some cases continuing examinations. And what do you do is usually assessed by some form of observation, audit, and practice analysis. But we might want to think about that alternatively, which is, again, following on the insights of the QI literature and the psychological literature and the motivational literature. What if performance is at least as much a function of what professionals are? And in fact, the knowing and the doing are dependent rather than independent variables. And more basic characteristics are the actual independent variables of import, e.g., are people humble, and do they have a healthy dose of self-doubt, in which case they are more likely or are less likely to just assume that what they're doing is first rate, and they are more likely to pay attention to being an outlier in terms of their own practices. Are they willingness to subordinate tradition and persistence in their own comfort level to new scientific evidence about what's on or what's not? So if we expect practitioners to change their practices based on new evidence, you have to be disposed to subordinating what you've always done to the new evidence. Are you a motivated knowledge seeker? Maybe more important than anything you know right now, particularly in a world where it's much easier to have to bring the knowledge to bear and to get hold of it in real time when you need it, because it's just a smartphone a couple of clicks away and so forth. And is a practitioner inclined to view excellence as a collective and collaborative responsibility rather than the lone wolf phenomenon where you don't want your colleagues examining your practice, you're reluctant to talk to them about theirs, and you're all isolated? So I think if those things are true, and I suspect the QI people might suggest that they are, then we need to find ways in regulation to measure those things as well as the more formal approaches that we've done in the past. Another big question for regulation and regulators is whether contemporary health human resource culture helps or hinders system performance. And I think all of these features come into play now, while patients need holistic integrated care from teams that are all conceptually committed to the same kinds of things and have a common understanding, not necessarily of the discrete things that they do in a specialized way, but of the purpose of the whole team approach and all of the interventions that someone might get. Well, you have a system that is inherently splintering because of the expanding knowledge base. Specialization is partly a function of the inability of anyone to master all of healthcare knowledge because it explodes and it doubles so frequently. So we have more and more specialization, deeper and deeper specialization, and yet we expect it all to work together in service of a whole patient. It's very difficult. Similarly, we've increased entry to practice credentials in many disciplines. In my country, occupational and physical therapy are now master's degree entry, nursing transition from diploma to degree in most provinces a decade or more ago, et cetera, et cetera. And whatever else this might achieve, and I think there's a huge debate about it, it does make workforce adjustments longer and more difficult. So if you do need a change in supply and composition, it takes longer to do. It does discourage some students from entering health science education programs because it takes longer and is more expensive. And then the more specialized and the more credentialed occupations become, they tend to have more disputes over scope of practice and gatekeeping roles because all of them tend to want to expand their scope of practice at the top end, but are reluctant to give up certain tasks and delegate them to others or allow others to do them at the bottom of their scope of practice. And I think this is a cultural problem that hinders both regulators and health system performance. Excuse me, and I don't want to say that the whole thing should be entirely fluid, of course. I mean, there is a reason why certain occupations are allowed to do certain things and others are not. But there's a huge amount of research that shows that there is a mismatch between what people are capable of doing and what they're allowed to do. Here are some examples here. In India, there are people with 6 months and less training doing very good, high-quality cataract work. In my country and in yours, it takes an ophthalmologist with 9 years of medical training. And moreover, in my country, many ophthalmologists do nothing but cataract. So all of the training that they have in other forms of eye disorders and more complex things, all the underlying medical knowledge that they have really lies fallow for the rest of their careers. And that's a huge investment on their part and a huge investment in the public's part in training them to do a repetitive technical task. And you can write that book 1,000 times over with super specialization, and anybody who does relatively low risk, high volume work, it finds him or herself in the same boat. We've had 45 years of nurse practitioner studies, RCTs, high quality observational studies, showing that they can do 70 to 90% of what GPs do, but in most places in the world are underdeployed, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it is true that progressive regulatory regimes, when you read them, and the formal requirements have tended to de-emphasize exclusive scope of practice claims, and the system is formally more fluid. But in practice, the battles are still fought out every day, and it is by no means a fully agile, fluid system anywhere in the world where the scope of practice is truly based on demonstrated ability to do something, apprenticeship and continuous learning programs that allow people to acquire new capabilities and so on. So the theory is still quite a bit, I would argue, ahead of the practice. Another big challenge for regulation and regulators as career-long excellence. So we have at the very beginning, at the entry to practice stage, very formal and tight and highly scrutinized requirements. So it's a rigorous and quite standardized enterprise to become a registered nurse, a doctor, a physio, a pharmacist, and so on. But then we have huge variation and a major dropping off in rigor and standardization of continuing competency requirements. In most professions, there is still little or no formal recertification. All of them have continuing education requirements, but they are, and I think this is literally true, compared to auto mechanics and fast food employees, it's a highly diverse, idiosyncratic approach, largely self-defined, and in a literal way, it's not nearly as rigorous. So I think, of course, the explanation for this is that regulators do not have the resources and the capacity to oversee a very large standardized enterprise needs-based of continuing education in any profession. Because a perfect system would tailor the continuing education regimen to what your needs are. And that means people have to know what their needs are. They have to be validly measured and expressed. The continuing education has to be tailored, and then you need to see what the results are. That is quite a massive enterprise. So the assumption has been that once competent initially at the beginning of the career, the presumption is of competence for the rest of the career. That's an optimistic presumption given the knowledge-based changeover and the inevitable decline and ebbing and flowing of capacities, knowledge, and experiences over the course of a multiple decades career. The proffered example of how to do this better is recertification, but recertification has its own challenges and it may not be as meaningful, rigorous, timely, and transparent as one might like. Just to anchor it in relation to other occupations, we wouldn't accept a 10-year interval for any kind of formal reassessment of an airline pilot or an inspection of a restaurant, or even an auto mechanics competency review, or even in the health field, lab tests, audits, and reviews. But we do for professions. In many professions, there is no formal ongoing or subsequent mid-career assessment of competency. And even where it's done in medicine, for example, jurisdictions quite rightly think it's major progress when they manage to get this done every 10 years. And every 10 years is a pretty big interval, and a lot can go wrong and a lot can change in 10 years. So a lot of harm can be unaddressed if we don't have the capacity to do it more frequently. And of course, we can talk about solutions in the discussion, but one solution, of course, is to somehow assemble, use data so that a lot of this can be automated, especially risk assessment. Another big conceptual challenge is whether or not collaborative practice demands collaborative regulation. We hear constantly that contemporary healthcare, especially for people with complex needs, multiple chronic conditions, often with some overlay of cognitive impairment in the very old and so on, you need a team approach. Well, if the team is the new unit of import in determining whether or not you're going to get good care, and if that team is able to self-organize in order to maximize the contribution of each team member, who may have different experiences, they may have different competencies irrespective of their formal identities. For example, a nurse with 20 years of experience is likely to know a lot more about many things of relevance to a person with multiple conditions than a physician just freshly minted out of a residency and so forth, and vice versa. So if team-based care is the norm, can we assume that highly competent individuals will create a whole that is greater than and overcomes the limits of the parts? Well, I don't think anybody knows how to regulate a team. There is no regulatory regime that looks at the team rather than the individual constituent members of that team as the unit of analysis. But if we mean what we say about excellence being team-based, surely we need some way of regulating or at least assessing and evaluating a team that is distinct from what we might say individually about the members of that team. That's a huge dilemma, I think, for regulators. And again, I think many regulators are wrestling with this right now. So then to be, maybe just to start some discussion, let's do the thought experiment that health professional regulation magically disappeared. It just fell into a chasm or was legislated out of existence. Would the sky fall in? Well, I'm not sure it would, actually, because in a way, regulation is unintentionally, perhaps, a bit of a crutch for others to let down their guards and not be as vigilant about whom they're hiring and how those people are performing in practice. So if you allow the regulator to make all the decisions about, well, is the education good enough? Should they be licensed? Are they formally competent to do certain things? And you aren't as vigilant about this as the employer, then perhaps we are all misled and it does nobody a service. So I think employers and organizations generally would have to step up their performance and improve their game in order to fill in the gap led by health professional regulation. I'm not suggesting that would be a good idea. I'm not suggesting that would be efficient, but it might be effective. And it might change what they're looking at in terms of how they define competence rather than just allowing self-regulating professions to define competence and so forth. So when you think about it, and I've talked to regulators about this, and they sort of say, you know, that's quite possibly the case. It would be an interesting experiment to see what that would be like, and if in the end of the day, it might actually have some pluses as well as some obvious minuses. So to sum up, just a couple more slides, these are some possible transitions in regulation. On the left, of course, is what I think is the historical focus. Excuse me. And here's where I think it may be moving in the future. I think regulators would probably mostly say, you know, we would like to move in that future direction, but they do have legislated mandates that require them to spend a lot of time and effort on that left-hand side of the distribution curve, the outlier phenomenon, the reaction to complaints, and the disposition of complaints and discipline and so forth. I think they are actively searching for ways to be more right-side oriented here, but it is a challenge for structural and other reasons. So that, to simplify it perhaps too much, quality assurance versus quality improvement, or that I think is a regulator's dilemma, because we know what their formal authority is designed to achieve. It's a legislated mandate from governments that's focused principally on safety. But the QA era has morphed conceptually into a QI era, which is quite different. I think they're a continuum for sure, but I think if you believe, as I do, that quality in the middle of the curve, especially in complex needs populations, is in itself a problem, the middle of the curve is not good enough, then I think the system has no choice but to do QI. The question is, can and should regulation map onto a QI focus? And this is just a way to, you know, my artwork is not obviously advanced, but I think that's kind of where on the continuum does regulation want to go? So we know that it's heavily involved in the left side of this. The leftward three elements are common to virtually every health professional regulator. How far can you go on the right, and do you want to go there? And of course, it requires different approaches if you do. Well, these are complex issues for all sorts of reasons, and I have great empathy for regulators trying to wrestle them to the ground. But I do think there is a source of power and influence that regulators can wield that is independent of what they might do structurally, and that doesn't cost them any money, which is to use their voice. Regulators, the ones I know, they're really thoughtful people, and they're intelligent, and they know what's wrong with the system. They get the middle of the curve problem, and they know that a whole lot of environments are not conducive to high quality healthcare. So my suggestion to them is use your voice where you can. You should be able to say things and launch conversations that you don't have to own. It's not your job to fix every problem in the healthcare system. But if you're really serious about a regulatory regime that encourages health professionals to practice as well as they can and serve the public interest, then among other things, you have to identify the characteristics of environments that are conducive to that. There is little point in sending excellent people into bad environments where they are set up to fail. Moreover, if accreditation and the other elements and other forms of accreditation aren't integrated with and linked to and united by the common vision of health professional regulators, the public interest won't be served because it is a chain and any weak link could be fatal to the enterprise. So I think that using the regulatory voice is pretty important, especially on issues like truth-telling, transparency, and identifying where elements of the system just aren't conducive to high-quality professional practice. So in conclusion, I think healthcare is a team sport, and regulating the team and understanding team dynamics is therefore very important. I think it does require collaboration both within and across occupations, services, and programs. So it's not just that the professions have to work more closely in a more integrated way, which again, I think Australia should take a bow in advancing. But it's also the notion that excellence and being a professional is a collaborative and collective, mutually accountable exercise, not just a bunch of smart people doing good work on their own. I think the third bullet would be probably the one that I feel most strongly about, that an incompetent environment will defeat competent individuals. And somehow I would hope that health professional regulators would wade into this territory, collaboratively with others, of course. And I do think for health professional regulation to be both relevant and impactful in the future, it's going to have to adapt to the emerging cultural and environmental factors that we know to affect system performance, to pay attention to issues like measurement, how can we harvest from already existing data sets important information that will allow us to do evaluations, do assessments, increase our understanding of where the problems are and where the successes are in a much less labor-intensive way. We do an entire session on artificial intelligence, harvesting big data, and other possible and possibly clever ways to get at some of these issues in a less labor-intensive way. I don't think they're on the immediate horizon, but I think they will come into play. And again, I think that's part of the regulatory dilemma that they're confronting, but it's also a huge opportunity. So I will stop there and look forward to any comments and questions that you might have.
Well, thanks, Stephen. That was fascinating. It was yeah, really interesting to get that viewpoint on regulation in the broader context. I'll start with a point of clarification. Just some, so Oliver has posted, Oliver Franks posted a question just relating to your claim about the fact that nurse practitioners can do 70 to 90% of what GPs do. I think I saw this on Twitter last week, actually. So is that a recent study that's put that forward?
It is what the lay's systematic reviews have shown. These studies started in the 70s, and I think when last I checked, there were about somewhere between 40 and 50 large-scale either RCTs or observational studies. I don't think people study it much anymore, frankly, because I think it's so well established that why do you need to do it again? So I think the literature is, to be fair, probably a bit old. I think most of it came to a conclusion in the 80s and 90s. Okay.
So yeah, I was just asking if you'd be able to make the slides fail, but that will be fine, won't it? So if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to type them in. I've got a few things that I noted down as you were talking. The one thing is around the recertification, and I thought I recalled reading there was something going on in England around recertification. So is I guess what is going on in England, and what else is going on elsewhere in terms of?
My understanding is that England and the US are farthest down this road, where they are actually requiring formal recertification of doctors, which involves an enhanced assessment and in some cases even some form of, though not a replication of the initial credentialing examinations. I think the jury is out about whether they've got it right. I think the debate still is this necessary? Do we think that some other form of mid-career exam taking is really an accurate proxy? Is it perhaps the case that just the fact that you have to go through it has a salutary effect on you keeping up and so on, because you know you're going to have to do that? There are huge pedagogical and other debates about whether this is the right thing to do, but I think what's incontestable is that it's a response to the quite large and persuasive literature that competence drops off over time for everybody. I mean, you have to do something. And the old, which I would regard as sort of amateurish and haphazard, frankly, approach to continuing education wasn't cutting it. So this is supposed to be a corrective for that. And it'll be interesting to see how, as they go through it, what the actual impact will be and what the effect size will be, and how much harm does it save and or how much excellence does it produce by making people go through this.
Yeah, because I was at actually an event last week where we were talking about clinicians' capacity to be involved in quality improvement. And it was broader than the regulations. It was accreditation issues, and someone was making the point that that clinicians have capacity to undertake non-clinical activities, but a lot of that capacity is taken up with addressing regulatory and accreditation issues, and that if they had less of that to do, they could spend more time actually doing that local quality improvement activity. So what are your thoughts on that?
I couldn't agree with them more. In fact, as I've said to regulators, if you imagine a world, which we always have to imagine, even though it's always happening in 2 years, where you had real-time information that was pretty valid and pretty comprehensive about how well people were practicing, why would you need any of the regulatory stuff? Because regulation, even in its best form, they're proxy measures. They're cross-sectional or partial and indirect. So completely correct. I think what's important in this is that if we, which I think is plausible to suggest we ought to, if we think that you can't possibly have a good program, good practice, good organization that doesn't embrace quality improvement, why is it optional? Why isn't it a fundamental aspect of practice that you participate in as a matter of course? And that's where I think I would hope that regulators, as well as other organizations, would come to some consensus on and say, you know, what we really need to do when we're doing accreditation, for example, instead of ticking off all these boxes and having people prepare 500 pages of manuals, you have to say, tell me what your requirements are for participation in quality improvement and show me how you pay attention to the results. To me, as a citizen, a prospective patient, that would give me a lot more confidence than all of the, you got 3 years of full accreditation in hospital X, and all of you people are brilliant graduates of Monash University. So that's clearly not sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I liked your point about the use of health systems data to contribute to that role. So would you see that as as potentially a kind of screening role, that you kind of would use the health system's data to potentially identify maybe at-risk clinicians, and then you kind of focus in on those clinicians?
Yes, and I think, again, where they are able to get their hands on some of it, and regulators vary in size and capacity, and their jurisdictions have different data architecture and so on, they do use it to identify risks. I think it's important to identify risks. Interestingly enough, when complaints and discipline events play out, it seems always the case that, oh yeah, well, we always knew that, or yeah, we had reason to think that Joe wasn't doing well. So you don't need data for some of this stuff. You need courage, and you need accountability and people stepping forward. But by all means, you can find some risks and identify subgroups with the clever use of data. And we should do a lot more of that. I think what it would do, if you even started using what we have, is it would give us another take on what's useful data and what's actionable data. So it might alter the data simply by virtue of using it for something important. And it would also, I think, create a bit more unity of purpose, because a lot of clinicians fear data now because they think the data are used only for, the best thing that can happen is that they're not punished by it. But if they start seeing it as something that can actually help, and that a CQI approach to this is a lot better than someone complains and we slap you on the wrist for it, I think it relaxes people, and it creates an environment where people actually embrace and seek data rather than endure it, which I think is still significantly the case, alas.
Yes, it's all to do with culture.
Yes, absolutely.
So what's your experience in terms of developing that culture?
It's hard. It's a hard slog. It's better than it used to be, but I think what's key is it's pretty simple, but it's not done very much. You need co-design. I mean, give clinicians, and I don't mean just doctors, give all clinicians, say, look, if you survey clinicians, they all say, we would love more data about our practices to help us improve. I think it's a socially desirable response because, you know, we've got evidence in my erstwhile province that even though they say that, when you offer them data about their own practices, almost none of them ask for it, and almost none of them use it. So that needs to be worked through. But if you say, look, you have a chance to design an information system that will meet your needs. You've always said that all these information systems are just for bureaucrats and for some formal accountability, but they don't help patient care. I take them seriously on that. Say, fine, how would you design it? So again, it's not rocket science, but it's shocking how little data architecture actually is co-designed by the relevant people who we hope would use it for quality improvement purposes.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're currently going through that process in South Australia. So SA Health have just released the quality improvement portal, which attempt to co-design a process with the clinicians. So yeah, I'm kind of interested in how that's going to work and what kind of evaluation we could do to investigate.
It's also a bit of a catch-22 because the clinicians who are most interested in helping design the data and in using it, they probably don't need it. They're probably conscientious and they're always paying attention and they're not so sure that what they're doing is right. And the late adopters and the resistors are the ones who need it the most and the least likely to take it up. So that's you know, I wish Roger's diffusion of innovation curve actually was true, but I think there's a hard point in so much of healthcare where once you get the early adopters, you don't get the late adopters.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah. I think it also links back to capacity, what we was talking about right at the start there, that you know, if you could free up capacity so that clinicians could spend more time in those areas, that would have an impact.
Yes, I think so too. And you can't expect any regulatory regime to have that capacity. And I don't even think it's a good idea for it to have that capacity because it's more us and them. You know, it's still extrinsic and external. I think it needs to be much more internalized. And I know this is heresy because I'm a data geek too, but I care less about standardization than about use. You know, if Adelaide had a data set that looked different from Melbourne, so I would say, oh, damn it, because I'd like to compare the two. But if they were all using their data and getting better, the public interest is served.
Yeah, yeah. And if there were differences, then the better performer could teach
yes, indeed,
learn from the better performer. The issue around teams was also interesting. And one thought I had there was that an area of work I'm doing a bit of work in is multidisciplinary teams for cancer care. So are you aware of any regulatory oversight of those types? Because that would seem to be a reasonable place to start.
I think there is regulation, particularly in sort of life or death kinds of clinical areas. There's a lot more oversight and regulation of quality and a greater attempt to standardize. But I don't think that means we have an understanding of your team and we are going to either certify or license or somehow give some regulatory stamp of approval to how your team is doing. Because I don't think anybody knows how.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess in multidisciplinary teams, at least there's potential there to look at.
Well, and again, I would love, you know, the way you do it is, I think the way you start is, so look at places, whether it's in primary care or in a programmatic area. What do your teams look like? And if you say, anecdotally, say, well, these are really high functioning teams and we actually have good outcomes, ask them what it is. I mean, I would like them to generate the variables that you would measure, and whether it's qualitative and quantitative or something else, because my hunch is what makes a good team is going to be in many ways qualitative. It doesn't mean you can't quantify some of it, and it may be you do use validated scales about psychological attributes, collegiality, communication, and so on, but I think the initial conversations will be quite revealing about what makes a good team. It's no different than in sports, actually. You hear people talk about the locker room culture. I don't think it's just vague voodoo. I think there's something to it, but you need to know what it is.
Yeah, yeah. So for everyone, Stephen was the administrator of, what was it, at MASH, which stands for?
Oh, a MASH blog, yes, Meaningful Analogies in Sports and Health.
Yeah, which unfortunately is no more, but it's a very interesting topic. Okay, well, I think we've got to the end of our allotted hour, and that's been, I've certainly found it fascinating. I'm sure all the participants did as well. Unfortunately, I always say we can't provide a round of applause. Sarah and I are the only ones who could provide the round of applause, but I'm sure there's a virtual one going on. So thanks very much, Stephen, and we hope to involve you with the association whilst you're here in Australia.
Thank you, and for anyone who's tuned in, you've got my contact information. So if there's some particular thing you want to have some more communication on, including taking issue with anything, feel free. Be happy to communicate.
All right, that's great. And yeah, a video of the webinar will be up on the association's website within the next few days, thanks to Sarah. All right, thanks very much.
Thanks.